Hello, everyone. Today we're going to continue our discussion of colonial society in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we're moving to a new set of topics. If you see so far, we have discussed the economy, we have discussed um, the histories of conquest and establishment of colonial rule in Latin America and the region in general, the creation of the viceroyalties, all the bureaucracy and political structure of the colonial empires, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires in Latin America. But today we're moving on to talking about class and the interconnection this has with race. And in general, what was the social classification and the social groups that we can find in colonial Latin American society? Already shown you these images before that you can see it right here in the presentation when we talk about what was the society of caste or sociedad de castas, right? Like the way in which the Spanish Empire classified all its subjects in Latin America and the Caribbean during the colonial period according to what was called like the blood and origin, right? So if it was an Spaniard and an Indian, we have a mestizo. If it's a mestizo and an Spaniard, we have a castizo and a Spaniard and a Spaniard, right? And we saw how this also means they have different rights and a different social place in this society. So what we're moving on from this now to discuss more specifically, the social groups that we can see in this colonial Latin American society. So, the first thing that we must have in mind when we're discussing the social class, racial structure, and these social groups I was mentioning of Latin American society is the influence of the Iberian Peninsula's culture and social stratification from before conquest and how it unfolded in Latin America and the Caribbean. Because we cannot forget that Iberian society, Spanish society, Portuguese society, and the same is going to be with the French, the Dutch, the English, and all the colonial empires in Latin America. They came from highly hierarchical societies, right? Particularly when we're talking about Spain and Portugal in the 16th century, we're talking about a society, right, that was divided mostly between nobles, right, the nobility, the higher class of the society, the clerics, all the religious class, and what they would call the commoners, which is pretty much the rest of the people. And this hierarchical division of society is going to influence the way in which colonial Latin American society is established. Of course, in the case of Latin America, it's going to have an additional term because it became also a racial classification, right? It was not just anymore about nobles, clerics, and commoners. Now it's about like the society of caste we were mentioning. It has to do with your origin, with your ancestry, right? So in that context, the people of indigenous African and mixed descent are going to be placed as inferior, right? And then we're going to have Spaniards and their descendants, as we have already discussed in other class, at the top of the society. But even among the Spaniards and this high class, we're going to find very important differences that we want to analyze today. So the first thing I want to mention is like what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Spaniards and we're going to see who were the elites, right? Who were the middle groups, and then who were the people who were at the bottom of the social and economic structure of the society. So let's start with the elites. So the first thing it's remember the way in which Latin America, colonial society was established in Latin America. We have very important cities. In many cases, these cities were, for instance, the replacement of the capital of indigenous empire. That was the case of Tenochtitlan, right, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and then is going to become Mexico City, the capital of the viceroyalty of New Spain. Or we have the case of Lima, right? Remember that in the case of the viceroyalty of Peru, the capital was Lima, but Lima was not the capital of the Inca Empire. The capital of the Inca Empire was Cusco. But the Spaniards are going to found Lima in the years following the conquest of the Inca Empire because Lima was on the coast, right? And the fact that it was in the coast is going to make easier the communications with other parts of the Americas and with Spain, of course. So I mentioned this because this colonial Latin American society, remember, is going to be basically a city, an important city such as Mexico City, such as Quito, such as Lima, such as Bogota, such as Caracas, right? Like all these places are going to be fundamental in the city, and they're going to have a huge rural area surrounding it, right? Um, Remember that at this point, we're talking about the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Most of the population of Latin America is going to live in the countryside, not in the cities. But each of these cities is going to have an elite, right? An elite that is going to dominate the economy, that is going to dominate the political system, that is going to dominate, of course, the social classifications we're talking about. And we're talking about these elites based in the cities connected with the countryside. We're going to find very different groups. We're going to find ranchers, we're going to find planters, right? Ranchers meaning like the owners of, for instance, cattle ranch states, but in general of land holdings. We're talking about planters. Remember, sugar plantations were a fundamental part of the economy. So we're talking about sugar plantations, we're talking about tobacco plantation. Later, we're even talking about coffee plantation, right? We have miners. Remember that besides sugar, the most important commodity when we're talking about Latin American society during the colonial period is going to be silver, right? We have merchants, the people moving things from one side of the Atlantic to the other. We have, of course, high-ranking churchmen, all the people involved in the high hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and all sorts of bureaucrats. We already discussed some of these, such as the viceroys, for instance. Remember these representatives of the power of the king in each and every one of the viceroyalties existing in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the last thing to keep in mind is that, of course, like all these hierarchies we mentioned are coming, right, from Spain. But it's not that like the same nobility that held power in Spain or Portugal is going to come to the Americas. People that we already discussed, such as Hernan Cortés or Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru and the conqueror of Mexico, they didn't come from distinguished families back in Spain, right? But military victory is going to place them at the top of colonial society. And it's precisely the heirs of these early conquistadors and the first Iberian settlers in America that are going to become the top of this colonial society. So let's talk about the first group that we have in our elites in Latin America, and that's bureaucrats, right? Remember that one of the most important characteristics about bureaucrats is that most of them are going to be, were going to be at that point Iberian born, right? They had to be born in Spain, they had to be born in Portugal because of the way in which the legal system and political system worked back in the day in colonial Latin America. So they were born in Spain, right? But what's going to be very characteristic, particularly of lower ranking bureaucrats, not the case, for instance, of the viceroy, but people under the viceroy in charge of security, in charge of tax collection, to give you some examples. They were rarely men of great independent wealth. They had a higher political power, but they did not have a high economic power. Because remember that most of the wealth, when we're talking about colonial Latin American society, is coming from miners, it's coming from merchants, right? It's coming from planters. Remember, it's coming from producing and moving sugar, producing and moving silver. From the mines to Spain, from the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and other places to back to Spain. So even though these Iberian-born bureaucrats held a higher position in terms of politics, they had a lower position in terms of their own wealth. They didn't have that many resources. And miners, merchants, and planters, even if they were not Iberian born, but they were the descendants of Spanish colonies or Portuguese colonies who were born in the Americas, they're going to have more money than them, right? Than the bureaucrats. And that's why many bureaucrats are going to consider they were undercompensated, right? They were not paid enough. And they're going to abuse institutional power. What means abusing institutional power? Corruption, right? We know how corruption works. It's been part of state systems from back then all the way to our present. But in this case, the corruption of these bureaucrats comes precisely from the difference, from the gap of someone holding this amount of political authority that is not back economically, right? Because the economic power is held by another group within this society. And that takes us to discuss, of course, who were the ones who actually held most of the money, right? Who were the wealthiest portion of this colonial Latin American society. And that's going to be merchants, right? Because remember, again, we have silver mines and we have sugar plantation. That's most of the political economy of colonial Latin American society. And that materials have to be moved. Like if you have a lot of sugar of the coast of Brazil or Cuba or the Dominican Republic, if you have silver that you collected in Potosí in Bolivia or that you collected in Zacatecas in Mexico, it's actually worthless unless you're able to move it, right? You have to be able to move it to Spain, you have to be able to move it to Europe, and from Europe, of course, it's going from many places. We have register, for instance, of the silver from the mines in the Americas going all the way to China, right? So it was about moving this merchandise. It's what we call like merchant capitalism, way before industrial capitalism emerged with Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. And who were these merchants? Are going to be, in many cases, I was mentioning not necessarily Iberian born, but born in the Americas. And they were living in the most important cities back in the colonial period, which are going to be Mexico City and Lima. Remember, Mexico City, capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, present-day Mexico, and the Lima, capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, present-day Peru, but also parts of Bolivia, Chile, and other countries. And particularly the merchants in these areas were the most powerful residents in the New World, even if they didn't hold directly the offices of the colonial bureaucracy in the region. And why were they so powerful? That has to do with the monopoly trade system that was created by the Spanish crown, mostly to benefit the merchants and to control the traffic of commodities, again, particularly silver and sugar, from the Americas to Spain and to Europe. And what is a monopoly trade system? Like monopoly, like if we take just the first word, right? Monopoly means that someone has an absolute power over the circulation of certain commodities, right? Like there is no competition. Monopoly is the opposite of competition. And in particular, when we're talking about the trade monopoly, right? And when we're talking about the trade monopoly system, what that means is that only a small group of people were allowed to move the silver. Only a small group of people were allowed to move the sugar. And if you have no competition, right? If you have no competition, you can impose the prices. You can impose the amounts that you move. And that's precisely what's going to give all the power to these merchants, particularly as I was mentioning in Mexico City and in Lima. And of course, as with any monopoly trade system, they're going to enrich themselves mostly because they control imports and retail sales, like how much you move, how much you charge, right? And this monopoly trade system is going to stay in place for most of the colonial period in Latin America. Um, when you think about the pirates, for instance, that we discussed in an earlier presentation, um, part of what the pirates were doing was trying to break down this monopoly trade system. They were actually also trying to trade, but precisely because just a certain number of Spanish merchants were allowed to move these materials from the and these commodities from the Americas, is that the British Empire, to give you an example, is going to promote piracy in the Caribbean to try to get hold and get some influence into this trade between Spain and the colonies in Latin America. But it was not just the merchants, right? We have also the rural elites. And remember that the rural elites are going to be very, very important because Latin America back in the day was mostly a rural society. Most of the people lived in the countryside. And that was the case up to the mid 20th century. In most Latin American countries, with certain exceptions, such as Argentina, and most of the population is going to live in the countryside. And when we're talking about elites in the countryside, like these rural elites, their power, their their status in society comes from owning large estates, right? And we're talking about large estate, we're talking about haciendas, to give you an example, such as the one you can see here in this picture, which are basically a big house, right? Where in most of the cases, this landlord is going to live surrounded by immense amounts of land. And this land, of course, is not going to be inhabited because you need people to manage it. You need people to work it, to plant the land, to harvest the land. So basically, you're going to have this house surrounded by a huge amount of land in which you also have indigenous people, you have sometimes free people of color, of enslaved Africans, and other sorts of groups in colonial Latin American society that live around this big house. And these rural elites, they were the closest in colonial Latin America to the feudal lords in medieval Europe. Remember that in this period of time, particularly, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, even in Europe, you're going to find mostly a feudal system in which basically what you're going to have is that like a large state controlled by one person. Could be a duke, could be a marquis, right? Like all these nobility positions that existed. And they are going to, like these landlords in Latin America are going to live a life that is closest to that feudal system back in Europe, right? They enjoy wealth, they have large estates, they command numerous slaves, dependents in many, many cases of indigenous descent or mixed descent. But they're not going to be at the top of the pyramid in terms of the economic structure of Latin American society during the colonial period, um, because most of the money didn't come from large estate. It came from like this kind of haciendas. It came from, again, silver mines and sugar plantations. So they're going to be in the top. And planters and estate owners often are going to find their interests subordinated, right, to the commercial elite. And who was the commercial elite? Well, that's going to be mostly, of course, the merchants that we mentioned. And as we're going to see later in other presentations in the semester, of course, all of these members of the elite are going to marry each other. So it was not uncommon to find, the heir to hacienda to then marry the owner, like, the daughter of the owner of a mine, silver mine, and so on and so forth. Like it was very common for the elites to marry among them, to marry like the people in the same social class. And then besides the elites, and we have, the middle classes, the middle groups of colonial Latin American society. And in this case, it's basically all the Iberian settlers and their descendants, the Iberian immigrants and their descendants who were not part of the elites. Not all the people who migrated to the Americas from Spain or Portugal became rich, became wealthy. Not all of them could become, owners of silver mines or powerful merchants that were moving these commodities across the Atlantic between the Americas and Spain. So we have also middle groups. Middle groups that tend to live in the cities that have a lower position than these elites, but they're still going to be on top of, let's say, enslaved Africans or people of indigenous descent. And they're going to occupy a lot of positions. We have store owners, right? As the population increases, as we saw when we discussed the demographic tendencies and trends in colonial Latin American society, well, the cities are also going to become important, even if they're not the largest part of this colonial society. So you need stores. Then you have ecclesiastical positions, right? Positions in the church, but not all of them are going to be high-ranking churchmen. You also need someone in the lower positions. You're going to have attorneys at law, notaries, very important position for the regulation of private property, retail shops. You need taverns, right? Because of the people that's coming, you have supervisors, artisans, like all sorts of middle groups in in Latin American society during this period. Um, but even if these positions were under these elites we have already discussed, they were better off than enslaved African peoples of indigenous descent, of mixed descent, who didn't have an easy access to this kind of position. So, so if we have the elites, right? We saw mostly planters, merchants, landowners, high-ranking churchmen. Then we have these middle groups of Iberian immigrants who have like all sorts of professions, from attorneys to notaries and tavern and shop owners. Then who is the lower class, right? Who's the lower class? Of course, as we have seen already discussed before, it's going to be the people of indigenous descent, people of African descent, and mixed race people, right? So let's talk about first about the Indians. And we need to be like start by thinking, what does it mean when we say Indian, right? We discussed earlier in the semester when we were talking about conquest, how when Christopher Columbus arrives in the Americas, he thinks he's in India, right? And where the name Indian come from. In the 19th century, it started to change to indigenous, which was supposed to be less pejorative, but it's the same, right? It was supposed to be Indian. But when Columbus arrived and he says all the inhabitants in the Americas are Indians, right? We are making disappear pre-colonial distinctions. Uh, in many ways, right? First, the Aztecs were not the same as the Incas, were not the same as the Mayas, were not the same as the Mapuche, were not the same as the Carib, were not the same as the Tupi, right? Like all these indigenous societies have different language, different culture, different religious practices, different political systems, different histories, right? They were entirely different cultures that were um, reduced to the category of Indian. But then you have like even inside these societies, right? If you take the Aztec Empire, for instance, it was a highly stratified society. You have wealthy people and poor people. You have not owners and working people, merchants and working people, right? You're going to have all sorts of social structures within this Aztec Empire. The same for the Incas. But all of this disappears, right? All of this disappears when you simply label everyone as Indian. And we're going to see, and this is very important, you're going to see native royal families, right? Because you have royal families, wealthy families from before conquest, that slowly lose their ground, slowly lose their position on their push side. Remember when we discussed conquest, how important native allies were for guys like Cortés when he conquered Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire, or Pizarro when he conquered Cusco and the Inca Empire. And initially, they have an alliance with these people, and we know the example that I have given you so many times, that Tlaxcala near Tenochtitlan, right? Tlaxcala people, they support the attack on the city of Tenochtitlan, and for some years they're able to maintain their position in colonial Latin American society, right? But this position, they cannot hold it for a long time, because at the end of the day, they're just Indians, right? They're just reduced to this category. And Indian, the category of Indian necessarily goes under. Um, and in general, what we're going to have is that indigenous communities survive the colonial experience. Up to today, we have indigenous communities in every single country of the Americas: North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. There's indigenous peoples everywhere. But they change, right? Their culture and societies are substantially altered. Now we call them all indigenous. But precisely what we call them all indigenous, what they share, what's the common experience of them being indigenous, is that they were all colonized, right? Like that's what they have in common, that they were conquered and colonized. But just a reminder for you to keep in mind that even though even though we call them all Indians back then, indigenous today, or Native Americans in the case of the US and Canada, they were highly different society before conquest, and we just reduced them to the category of Indians or indigenous. And lastly, of course, we have the Black population, right? And remember that Black history in the Americas is strictly connected to slavery. Like we have to understand Black history in the Americas connected to slavery because that's the way in which enslaved Africans were. Like Africans were brought to the Americas, right? They were enslaved and they were shipped to the Americas as private property. So by the end of the 19th century, of the 18th century, I have a typo there. I will correct it later. By the end of the 18th century, um, nearly every elite and middle class household owned slaves, right? Slave holding was a very, very common practice. Of course, you see the sugar plantations in the Caribbean or Brazil. We're talking about plantation in many cases with hundreds of slaves. But you're going to find many examples in pretty much every single country of Latin America back in the day where you have, like just a family that has a slave, for instance. Um, because it was very common that you have enslaved people that were used in households, that were used in small shops. It was labor force at the end of the day. But even if slavery is going to mark the experience of the African population and their descendants in America, that doesn't mean slavery was unavoidable. We have manumission. We have discussed this later. And it was the legal procedure through which an enslaved African or an enslaved person in the Americas could gain freedom, right? It could be out of religious pity. It was common in some cases of slaves owned by the church, of exemplary service, right? This was also very common in the case of people like enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas, but back when they were African, they had an special a skill and a special ability that was highly sought after by their slaveholders in the Americas. And the same for cash payments. So you have examples of people again with some sort of special ability, for instance, the ability to produce armory, to create armory and working in armory. So they were able to charge a bit amount, like a small amount of money, a bit of money for their work, and then just save enough to make a cash payment to their owner to gain freedom. And this is very important because by the end of the colonial period, like 1750 to 1800, you're going to have large amounts of what we call gente libre color or free blacks, free people of color, in many places, in cities like Salvador, in the state of Bahia, in Brazil today. At the moment of independence, up to 40% of Salvador's population were actually free blacks, right? Not all of them were enslaved. And that's also going to have a huge influence in the cultures of all these cities in the future. Salvador Bahia, to give you an example, is one of the cities in Brazil with the strongest presence of African culture, from religion to food, in all of the Americas. So just to summarize, like we were talking about today, is social groups, right? If you see before, we're kind of like looking uh, uh, from conquest to establishment of colonial society, the colonial state, the colonial economy, and now what were the social groups, the kind of social classes that colonialism created in Latin America. And from here, we're going to move to other topics such as gender, family, and of course, by the end of our class, we're going to talk about the end of the colonial period. So this is all for today in our discussion of social classes and social hierarchies and classifications in colonial Latin American and Caribbean societies.